So now we're going to talk about architectures where several threads can share the same processors or threaded processors. Let's first repeat how our superscalar pipeline looks. So this was the simple example of a superscalar pipeline, where we, in this example, have two parallel pipelines. And the job of these two parallel pipelines was to run a single application faster. That meant that we could potentially fetch two instructions at the same time, for instruction fetch. We could decode two instructions. Those two instructions could both read registers at the same time. And it's important to note here that the two pipelines share the same register file. So it doesn't really matter from an instructions point of view which of the two pipelines it's selected for its execution. During the execution stage, that's when you have the big advantage, because you have replicated the ALU, so you can make produce several results in parallel for the two instructions. Coming to the memory stage, we now have a single shared first level cache and higher level caches as well. And then at the end of the day, we write back to the register file. So in this architecture, there is a single program counter that identifies where we are in the stream of instructions, and this program counter may be incremented one step or two steps depending on how many instructions are fetched. We also looked at a more detailed level at the implementation of this, where we took the more detailed pipeline and we replicated that into two different pipelines, where we still have one program counter with instruction memory. We could fetch two instructions at the same time. So we could make two reads from the register file. In the memory stage, we could typically can have two reads and one write port available in modern implementations of first level caches. But only the top pipeline could execute branches, and therefore and part of the reason for that is that we only have one program counter, and that's much easier to deal with that. But there are pipelines where actually you can allow both pipelines to execute branches as well. So that was the superscalar, executing instructions from a single thread, a single stream of instructions. So let's see how we can extend that to a multi-threaded version. So this is still a 5-stage pipeline. It's a two-way superscalar pipeline. But now we're going to extend it to be a multi-threaded two-way pipeline. So what that means is that we will be able to execute instructions from two different threads at the same time. Two different programs running by two, well, it could be the same program, but they are executed by two different threads or two different processes, actually. So we have two streams, and the great advantage here is that we can make our choice which instructions to start in parallel, looking at both of these streams. So more instructions to choose from, and of course the red instructions here are by definition independent of the yellow instructions from a instruction scheduling point of view. Since we have two streams, we have to add another program counter. From this picture, it looks like this program counter belongs to this instruction fetch, and the yellow program counter belongs to the top instruction fetch, but that's just the picture itself. So in a general way, we have to add another program counter to the architecture that may actually be used by either of the instruction fetch stages. We also have to replicate some other registers that are used to keep the state of the processor. So for example, such a register is the register used during table walk when we get a TLB fault, so that register help us find the first table of the hierarchical way of having these tables. And of course, since the red instructions and yellow instructions may be from different threads, and more importantly from different processes, that means that kind of state has to be separate between the two instruction streams. So this, we can make a choice here, but all instructions don't look exactly the same to the pipeline. So when you take an exception, a TLB exception for a red instruction, you should use the red state information, and when you take an exception for the yellow instructions, you should use the yellow state registers to handle that. Furthermore, in order for this to work, we have to replicate the register file, because of course these two streams of instructions should not read and write to the same registers. They should interact with each other in the register. And that is also, from that comes the positive fact that these instructions are, from a scheduling point of view, not dependent upon each other. There is no read after write dependence between a red instruction and a yellow instruction, and vice versa, because they don't share any registers. So the register file is replicated 32 new fresh registers. That means that all the instructions that flow in this pipeline have to be color coded. So they have to know whether they are yellow instructions or read instructions, so they would be able to handle the exceptions in the right way, but also so they would read and write the values to the correct register file. And that is pretty much all the additions we have to make to this pipeline compared to the previous pipeline. And from this, we get an architecture where we can mix and match instructions from two streams instead of one stream, and hopefully we could make this choice in a much smarter way. So let's talk more about what choices we can make. First of all, here's the quiz. So what resources are replicated for each thread in a typical multi-threaded architecture? There could be one or many answers. Now let's move on and see what kind of choices we can make in that multi-threaded pipeline. So there are two classes of scheduling we can have between the different threads. And the first type of scheduling is called fixed interleaving, and that was the first one to be used. And there may have been newer architectures than that, but there was an architecture in 1982, which was the HIP architecture, that I was incredibly excited about. But also one of the more recent architectures, Xeon Phi, released as recently as last year, is one of these fixed interleaving multi-threaded architectures. So what fixed interleaving means is that you divide the execution into, so let's say, odd and even red and yellow slots in a static way. So in a more general way to say that is if you have n threads executing in your multi-threaded architectures, then every of these threads can execute one instruction every nth cycle. So you have statically divided the execution slots between these threads in a static way. And the reason I'm using capital N here is because, for example, HEP architecture, I think it could schedule up to 128 simultaneous threads in its implementation. So N could certainly be much larger than the yellow and red, as we had in our simple example. Xeon Phi actually can schedule up to 4 threads at the same time, but it uses this kind of even and odd scheduling between pair of 2 of these instructions. So every thread running in Xeon Phi can actually execute every other cycle, even though there can be 4 cycles involved. If a thread is not ready to go when its slot turns up in the, then we're simply going to waste the cycle. So if it's not ready to go, the other thread cannot utilize its empty slot, so we're going to create a bubble in the pipeline. Recently, there have been many more intelligent ways of scheduling threads in these multi-threaded pipelines. And they are often hardware controlled. In the early days, some of them were software controlled. We're not going to discuss that in this course. So example of hardware controlled thread scheduling is that, for example, the hardware can keep track of which threads are ready to go. So let's say, like in Niagara, you can support many threads, 4 threads, 8 threads, 16 threads, depending on which architecture. I think Niagara 1 is 4 threads. Then you only looked at the threads that were not waiting for cache misses. So you potentially could schedule the same thread to run every cycle if you only had 1 active thread. But if there was a thread that was stalled because of a cache miss, then that thread was not interested in being scheduled at all. You can also have some hardware priority scheme. such as what was introduced in the early Pentium 4 hyperthreading, the first version of hyperthreading. A priority scheme which is fairly common is called iCount. And iCount simply looks at all the threads that are active running on a threaded architecture, and then you give priority to the thread that has least instructions in flight. So the thread that's been waiting the longest. And there have been lots of research on this, and it shows that that is actually a fairly good heuristic for doing this scheduling for various reasons. Another way, which is not directly related to any others, is to do what's called a coarse-grained scheduling. Here, you schedule one thread to run. And that thread runs as fast as it can, using every cycle, new instruction every cycle, until it gets blocked for some reason, which could be, for example, cache miss or some data dependence. And when it gets blocked, that's the point in time when you switch over to another thread to run. So each thread will run much coarser grained number of instructions as far as it can, and after it hits the wall, then we're going to apply a hardware supported thread switch to a different thread and let it run as long as it can. So let's look a little more at hyperthreading, which is the first commercial version of simultaneous multithreading. So that's when you actually mix and match instructions from several threads interleaved in the pipeline. It was a two-way SMT, so similar to the yellow-red scheduling as we saw before. It had lots of resources shared between the two threads, so caches, execution units, of course, but also things like branch predictors and some kind of state was just shared between the two threads, so they could sometimes interact with each other in an unfavorable way, and it could ruin each other's branch predictor history and so on, since those sources were shared. But the idea here of the first implementation of hyperthreading was to minimize the extra area needed to implement these features, because back then area, the chip area, was the limiting constraint of a design. Performance was so-and-so. So the spec benchmark, which are often used to tell how good an application is, there is a measurements called spec rate. And that means that if you have an architecture which is capable of running several threads at the same time, what you do in spec rate is that you run as many threads as you wish at the same time, and then you measure the throughput of the system. So it's not the time until one of the thread finishes, it's really the throughput you have in your system. And if you can run two threads at the same time, you should expect the spec rate performance to increase by a factor 2 if it's an architecture where you can scale linearly with the number of threads. But since this implementation of hyperthreading shared so many resources, you saw just a 1% improvement on the integer benchmarks and a 7% performance on the floating point benchmarks. And once more, this is when you schedule several threads to run exactly the same benchmark at the same time. That's how you measure the spec rate. However, if you mix and matched the different benchmarks from the suite to run sort of randomly together, so maybe one floating point, one integer, or one integer benchmark that used needed the branch predictor a lot together with another benchmark that needed the cache a lot. So if you have that kind of mix, it's easier to leverage the shared resource in a good way, because if one application has a low pressure on one kind of resource and another has a high pressure on the resource, then you will actually see a throughput improvement by having them sharing the same pipeline. So there you saw actually 20% performance improvement with those kind of mixes. Still, the hyperthreading was not regarded as a great hit. Many people I know from high performance computing actually chose to turn off the hyperthreading when they ran their application, because hyperthreading actually made many applications run slower rather than faster. But this was revived again in the Hail-MSO architecture. So 5 years ago, this idea was resurrected again big time, and this is now part of almost any high-performance architecture you see out there. Even low-performing architectures, so Intel Atom, which is supposed to be Intel's high, low energy offering for x86, has actually two-way SMT hyperthreading implemented. I should also highlight that there is a new version of Atom that just been released that is actually an out of order, it's slightly out of order implementation. It's a dual core implementation. It has much better performance and it's much more power lean than the good old Atom was. But anyhow, good old Atom, two-way simultaneous multi-threading SMT. So if you use the scheme called fixed interleaving scheduling of instructions between n threads, which of these statements are true? So one or more of them can be true. So it's the middle one. It lets threads take turns and run every nth cycle.